Good morning. Uh, I'm here with Ishmael Modney. My name's Tony Christ, and welcome to our podcast. I know we probably don't have many listeners. We missed last week. We do it at irregular times, but over time, for those of you that are listening, be patient with us because we're going to try to eventually work to going live at a very specific time. So Ishmael is coming to us from the great state of Texas, and I'm where I've been my whole life in Virginia. I thought, and I mentioned to Ishmael, I want to review. We have 13 papers posted on the website, and I'd like to review the papers that we've posted for a few minutes. And Ishmael, I have them right in my lap. You don't have, well, you can show the people the papers. We encourage
the website here.
We encourage you to go to the website because oftentimes during the podcast, we're discussing particular things and the papers have much more information in them. We welcome anyone that wants to show us some information that conflicts with what we're saying in any of the papers. We welcome it. We're about the truth. We're trying to get to the truth. It's a little bit difficult today, but that's our objective. Even though the papers on their face may sound very negative, our intent is very positive because you've got to understand where you are in order to determine where you're going. And we're not getting cooperation from the government in some respects in that regard. We're not getting cooperation from the news media in some respects in that regard. And we're trying to disclose everything we come across that we think people should want to know. So we've published 13 papers. We try to do one a week. We started out with a paper opposed to the consensus. And we talked a little bit about PCE in that paper. That's the first paper. The second paper, August 25th, we talk a little bit about labor productivity, non-farm labor productivity, which is of high interest to me. Now, there are things that can cause it to jump up. For example, a bunch of people can get laid off because it is output over cost in a very elemental sense. But to me, productivity is a very big thing, key to having a period of time where things are going to go positive if we can sustain it year in and year out. We did in the 90s, due to the internet, the adoption of the internet, we sustained productivity over 3.5%. The 75-year average, since it's being measured, was closer to 1.4%. This century, except for one quarter, the first quarter of 2020 and the last two quarters, this century, let's see, Bush oversaw a decline in productivity from the 3.5 to under 2. Obama tanked productivity down to around 1%. Trump raised it insignificantly, not to 2%. Biden had tanked it up till 2 quarters ago. Then out of nowhere, productivity jumped up. We discussed it in another article, which I'm going to get to in a minute. Productivity came out to be 3.5% 2 quarters ago, and last quarter 4.7%. And I only have one thing to say. Hello, artificial intelligence. It's being adopted in medicine. It's being used left and right. I do think
it's still early as well. That's the great thing about it. We're still in the early innings with it. We're still very early on it.
Now, as a caveat, I'll say one thing, and then we're going to move on to touch on some of the other topics. But productivity is obviously a very big thing with us. But during the Roaring 20s, productivity went through the roof. That was a time for the washing machine, the automobile, the adoption of electricity, on and on and on. Productivity went through the roof, and it ended in the Great Depression. So productivity certainly is not the only thing that we need to watch, but it is the encouraging thing today in the economy. And so we're going to keep watching productivity when third quarter productivity is released. We talked about the residue of Ben Bernanke. We felt just unbelievably that what the position he's put the country in is being felt today, and it's not good. We cited for you that Social Security payments have declined in buying power 36% this century. That's after the COLAs. And that's a good proxy for the middle class. So that you can take that same decline and apply it across the middle class. And that's going to dovetail into our next week's topic too, which exposes another agency that has been lying to the American public. And of course, raises the question, why? In both instances, the first agency that we called out was the Congressional Budget Office, and we talked about that after we talked about the three Fed chiefs, which was September 22nd, after Alan Greenspan. Although actually we should have said four, but there was a market change when Ben Bernanke came in, and people bought into holding rates low and printing money. And my God, that's what this whole century, the first quintile, the first 20 years of this whole century was all about. And that's what created the problems we're experiencing today. And we suggested when we talked about the three Fed chairs, the other two Fed chairs just followed Ben Bernanke in sync, Janet Yellen and Powell, until the system fell apart. Powell was a big Bernanke. I hear he talks to Ben Bernanke weekly anyway. So they were big Bernanke pundits. But the system.
And a little known thing there, as you know, I had a relative who worked at the Fed for years and years who passed away. So a couple years ago, and at his funeral were Yellen, Bernanke, and Powell, all very, very close, all three of them. Saw it firsthand myself.
Yeah, that's true. But we emphasize the point that the Federal Reserve cannot create wealth, and they can print pieces of fiat money backed by debt, but they cannot create wealth. They can stimulate the economy for short periods of time by offering inexpensive loans, putting people in debt, and the government itself. The U.S. Congress was very subject to the Fed's artificially low interest rates. They took the national debt from 5 to 6 trillion up to 33 based on these artificially low interest rates, which were creating all the banking problems you're hearing about today, which we're not out of, incidentally, and also creating the huge amount of debt and the cost of that debt, which today, now with the return of an interest rate, is skyrocketing. The interest cost per year to carry this huge amount of debt. We talked.
I do think, by the way, just to pause for a moment here, there is so much more that can be dug into on this. I think it's worth one more in terms of Bernanke's core philosophy of being able to financialize the economy over and over.
Well, look,
and we see the consequences of that.
Ishmael, the Nobel Prize is given out by government economists. So everything Bernanke did was to transfer power to the federal government that traditionally, arguably, in a more open, free society, was left with individuals. So were the costs and the decisions. And he transferred a huge amount of power to the federal government. And then we talked about the federal budget and the irreconcilable annual deficit it requires. We talked about the fact that the entitlement programs with the welfare programs compose 66% of what's spent, not what's raised in taxes, of what's spent in a year. We talked about the fact that, and looking at the debt clock at 33.7 trillion, you got to remember when McCarthy did his deal back in May, June, it was 31.4. So when you're hearing Congressional Budget Office, at that time they were projecting a trillion four in annual deficit shortfall. They've moved up to a trillion seven. But let's take out our fifth grade math. When you subtract 33.7 from 31.4, you're over 2 trillion. And it's still going, and we still have 7 weeks left this year before we know how much debt, more debt we've incurred. And this debt, too, has to be refinanced above 4%. It's not when Powell started doing this change from Bernanke, he was forced to because inflation had shot up to 9%. And at that time, totally due to Ben Bernanke, the interest rate carrying cost of the national debt of 28 trillion, 27 trillion when Trump left office was about 1.6, under 1.7%. Well, guess what? It's 2.9 today. And this coming year, we have 8 trillion of the 33 trillion that needs to be refinanced. It's coming due. And then we have the annual deficit again, which we don't know what it is, but we can say right now it's over 2 trillion. So that's 10 trillion that's, of the 33 and counting, that's going to have to be refinanced at over 4%, which is going to move us ever closer to 3%. And let's use our fourth grade math, third grade math. 3 times 3.4 is a trillion. So our interest bill, which was 640,000 last year, is going to be a trillion here shortly, not in 2033 like CBO advised, but probably even before 2028. And that's going to be a big crimp on spending. So entitlements and the debt are huge things that have to be reckoned with, and they have to be reckoned with soon. The giveaway period where politicians, and to their credit, you could maybe argue they solved poverty, but they caused so much dislocations and disruptions to the basic family unit. It raises a question of whether or not it was worth it. We talked about some hidden government laws. I don't want to get into that. We talked about the dollar, and is it becoming? It's probably becoming increasingly likely that the dollar is headed for a collapse. That has nothing to do with today, but when you look at the debt numbers, when you look at the ability to sustain it, and you ask yourself, this has nothing to do, incidentally, with Russia or China or India or anyone else. This is all internal. We've created this reality. Who is going to want to hold our debt? I wouldn't want to hold it. I mean, the ability, we have a good record. We've 100% paid it back. But at some point, as this keeps evolving, how is it going to get paid back? Are we going to turn on the printing press again, create more inflation? I don't think so. So we suggested that leadership is worse than absent. And that was in week 10. And by that, I mean the cardinal sin that I believe is being committed, and we discussed it with Ishmael, is omission. They're not telling you the whole tale. And when you leave out one piece, you can be just honest as Abe Lincoln on everything else you say, but leaving out that one piece changes the whole picture. And we're seeing it. I raised a question before the podcast with Ishmael. This past week, 10 billion was released to Iran. Well, the only reason we know that is because one congressman, a Republican, found it and disclosed it, or it would have never been made public. So the overriding question is, do Americans have the right to know? that 10 billion. Now, apparently it's Iran's money anyway, but do we have the right to know that they extended the the set aside of the sanctions for another 120 days, which gave Iran 10? Yes, of course we have the right to know. Why was the administration not disclosing it? That's the question. Why are politicians selectively disclosing, which is the equivalent of lying to me? Then we go to the family unit. We suggested, which is going to be next week's topic, that we stick a fork in it. We've beaten poverty. We'll talk about that next week. But the family unit has been eviscerated over by the government's own statistic. I don't want to quote other statistics because they're much higher. The government's own statistic, 25 million children are growing up without a father. And we talked about some of the effects. Violence is directly correlated with an absentee father. Mental illness, drugs, lack of achievement, all these things. As we try to invest, our biggest, most important investment of our lives is the next generation, our youngsters. And what have we done, or what are we robbing them of? And how can we address it presently today? And we talked about that on October 27th. Then we got to November 3rd, and I threw a paper out there that got quite a bit of criticism. The theme of the paper got lost on the issue of abortion, but the theme of the paper was, how do we view human life? The uniquely novel thing about America is we, by our Declaration of Independence, our first right was our right to life. And we're going to, interpretations of that, I think, are non-political. I think they're personal decisions. No politician should be involved one way or another in it. We got enough things politically to worry about. However, I found other things out there, 3 other areas. One of them, assisted suicides. Another one, hospice care by government in old age, and suggesting that there was an overuse of opioids in hospice care. And these are red flags of a change in the cultural outlook toward value of a human life. And these are all of equal interest, and plus the mentality that tolerates 700,000 abortions and says, well, we need workers. Well, if we need workers, why don't we not have 700,000 abortions? That would be 700,000 people a year, a significant amount. One generation, that's 15 million people, 17 million people. Anyway, the right to life issue is not only abortion, it's propping its head up in a number of different ways. And I suggested at the end of that rather than the exceptionalism of a life and the value of human life, we've started to view it as material, as we would any other material thing, and treat it that way. And that was in November 3rd. That was a recent week. After that, DEI, I've got somewhat of a controversial paper. It's being relied on by business. 3 fairly innocuous words that sound friendly and inviting: diversity, equity, and inclusion. However, when you peel them back and look at what's underneath it, and I think that's the message of the paper, the one thing that brought us to this point was merit, and the conditions that allowed our merit to grow were hope and opportunity. And those were the dual conditions. And we haven't gotten into discussing how hope and opportunity have changed. They certainly have changed, and not in a good way. But that was the way we built the country, and that was the way we created wealth. And so the takeaway from the DEI paper is, to me, at the very least, it's a massive justification for a lack of merit. based compensation. Discrimination used to be purely on merit. You can argue about whether this test is fair or that test is fair, but the point is, at the end of the day, you need some kind of a test to test everybody to see if the guy out in the middle of Mississippi is doing what the guy in Baltimore City did. You need some kind of a way to differentiate. My God, the Indians use them. The Chinese are very big advocates of merit in their education system, and we're the ones that taught them. And we've to retreat from that. Today, you even have Ivy League schools that are not requiring standardized tests. And, so it raises those questions. And you have things like the International PISA test given to 15-year-olds. We've sunk to 37th we were peerless in math. We've sunk to 37th in the world in math, yet we are the second biggest spender on K through 12 education. So those issues need to be discussed and addressed. And before Ishmael, so we've covered a lot of ground here in 13 weeks. And again, our object, you can very easily dismiss us and say, well, they're being negative. Well, we're not being negative. Our whole purpose is, before we try to find a way out for us, you need to know where we are. And people need to understand where we are. And we're trying our best to present them with the truth. And only if we understand where we are will we be able to figure out where we should go. And we do have problems, and they are huge today, and they must be acknowledged and recognized and dealt with. And unfortunately, our political class is not dealing with them because, frankly, because the population has been educated to feel entitled, they're unelectable if they deal with these things. They're not electable. So we're trying to make up for the lack of political leadership in telling the American public the truth. And so here we are. Now I'm going to give you a sneak preview, and then Ishmael and I will have a few more words to say. But before I give the sneak preview, Ishmael, do you want to say anything about these first?
Well, yeah, and I think, again, folks may think, oh, this is negative, or oh, it's one political slant or the other. Again, before we get on this podcast, we tend to have a vigorous debate, Mr. Chris and I, for about 30 minutes about the topics and about what we're talking about. We both agree on these are real issues. These are real things we have to acknowledge, and we have to identify the problem and then come together to find real solutions. Again, we both agree the biggest threat to this country and our future prosperity is internal. Comes internally. It comes from,
that's right.
To your point, an education system that is not pushing merit the way it used to. And I was bringing up the San Francisco system where Algebra 1 is no longer taught in 8th grade. That's something very recent. And typically what had happened were students who are excelling in math would have the chance to take Algebra 1 in 8th grade. And it may seem like a very minor thing, but it's a big deal. What it is saying is we are not going to push kids to excel. We're going to hold you back. So you can't excel, even though you're ready. And I think that's not a good thing. My own high school experience and my own middle school experience was taking the hardest classes and having the opportunity to take the hardest classes. I didn't always excel in every single one of them, but I was able to test into them and take them. So to me, that is something that really matters, is how are we encouraging excellence in this country? And to be frank, we aren't. And this is not a one party or another. This is not the media or anything else. There's a collective, and I don't want to use this term, but to me, there's a collective mediocrity that this country is willing to accept right now. And as Mr. Chris said, it's because the voters have become entitled, and you are willing to be entitled and not vote for those who will push, who will try and bring out the best in you. And that's where we're
And
at
it's
today.
no,
So
the sad part, the sad reality is we're giving the kids calories. The government is giving the kids calories, no longer the family, but we're not. They're almost uh, uh, totally unmotivated, and we're not investing in our human capital. Our human capital is a young generation. We're not investing in them. We're not by not discriminating in merit. We've sunk to 37th in the world in math. I mean, there are African countries around us. I don't even recognize the countries around us. Look at the international PISA test. Results are coming out from the 22 test soon. But we were peerless last century. Yet we're spending as much, if not more, than everyone but one country in the world to educate these kids. That's a huge problem.
We're unfortunately no longer striving for excellence. There's still a group of people who are, and they will do extremely well. But as we were talking about, again, I didn't grow up with very much money, but our house, our community pushed for excellence. And that's where we want to go. And that drives innovation. That it drives prosperity for everyone. So again, with where we're at right now, I know it sounds negative, and again, the two of us have very different opinions, thoughts on what's the best way forward, but we do agree on, hey, these are real things that matter. These are real things where objective fact demonstrates that these are problems that we need to solve. So that's what I say about it now and how we move forward. For someone like myself who is about to turn 42, it's going to be a problem that our generation needs to learn about, and it's time for us to step up and continue to find ways to solve them going forward.
Not one kid in the whole city of Baltimore passed mathematic proficiency. And math is just so critical. It's not critical because it's numbers and it's hard and I'm not interested. It's critical because it teaches you how to rationally think. So when you're not doing math and you look at propositions and ideas that you're inundated with, you don't become tribal and start screaming and jumping up and down. You understand, your intellect can deal with it, and you understand oftentimes the fallacy, why it's wrong, right from the start. And you don't invest all your time and energy in acting tribal and bouncing up and down at some college demonstration. But without math, without those cognitive skills that math gives you, we're not in a good place. 37th in the world is not a good place for America. Not if we want to continue to be a leader in the world. We're obviously not in math. So I guess we don't know how many viewers we have. We thank you for watching. We ask you to be patient with us.
I apologize. We had our family had a fourth child last week, so that's really why we record last week. So thank you, doing our part to keep the population afloat here. But that is the reason why our child came about a week early. So it was very exciting.
We're going to eventually have this live, and we're going to eventually do it a regular time every week. We thank you for watching. The few of you that are watching, we think it's a positive effort we're doing here. I'm going to give you a sneak peek into next week. Next week we're going to talk about the myth of poverty, and you got to be careful with that, because we do believe that the bottom 3 quintiles, the bottom 60% of the population, has had their buying power reduced 36% this century. And I'm talking specifically about Social Security payments. Their buying power of Social Security is down 36%. I'm using that as a proxy to say how the middle class has been eviscerated. However, the bottom 2 quintiles have come up, and another government agency is not telling us the truth. And it raises questions about why the government wants us to believe we have 12% poverty, when in fact, I think we're going to show next week with information we have, and it's been made public, that it's closer to 2%. So we hope you'll watch next week. I guess we'll call it the victory lap we should do over winning the battle against poverty, which no one really knows about because the government's not telling us. And we'll look at some of the side effects again that we've already touched on in prior sessions. The total evisceration of the family unit to get there. So we wish you have a blessed week. I'd like to thank you, Ishmael. Welcome your child to the world, your fourth child. And we look forward to seeing you next week. We hope you'll watch. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.